80 million records sold, 35 #1 hits. The voice that consoled America after September 11th. But today, at 66 years old, Alan Jackson can barely stand on his own stage. There's a degenerative disease stealing from him, piece by piece. The one thing that's defined him for 4 decades. His ability to perform. No cure, no treatment. Just a clock counting down to the day his feet won't be able to hold him under the lights anymore. And if you think that's the cruelest part of this story, you haven't heard about September 2018 yet. About the phone call that shattered his daughter's world in half. About the tragedy that not faith, not fame, not 40 years of success could prevent. How did a boy from Newnan, Georgia, who grew up in a house built by his own father's hands, become the conscience of country music? What happened behind the scenes that turned triumph into suffering? And why does he keep climbing onto that stage, stumbling, trembling, but still singing, even knowing each show might be his last? Before we begin, we need to go back to 1958, to a dirt road in Georgia, to understand where the voice came from that refused to give up, even when everything conspired to silence it. Alan Eugene Jackson was born on October 17, 1958, in the tiny town of Newnan, Georgia, a place so small that most maps barely noticed it. He entered the world not in a gleaming hospital, but in a modest home built by his father's own hands, a simple structure that would become both sanctuary and school for everything that mattered. His parents, Joseph Eugene, Daddy Gene Jackson, and Ruth Music Jackson, were not people of means or fame. They were working class in the truest sense. His father labored as a mechanic and a Ford dealer, his hands perpetually stained with grease and exhaustion. His mother worked tirelessly to hold together a household of 5 children, stretching every dollar until it screamed. The house Gene built sat on a dirt road, a tiny box with no pretense of grandeur. Alan, the youngest of 5, shared a bedroom with his sisters in quarters so cramped that privacy was a luxury no one could afford. There was no air conditioning to fight Georgia's suffocating summers, no cable television to distract from reality, no money for vacations or new clothes. But what they lacked in wealth, they overflowed with something rarer. Love rooted in simplicity, faith unshaken by hardship, and music that filled every corner of their lives. Gospel hymns on Sunday mornings, country ballads on scratchy radios, and the laughter of a family that knew how to find joy in the smallest moments. Years later, Alan would recall those days with a trembling honesty. We didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered: family, faith, and songs that made you feel less alone. For a boy growing up in rural Georgia, those songs were not entertainment. They were survival, a way to make sense of struggle, to give words to feelings too big to carry in silence. School was unremarkable. Alan was not the star athlete, not the academic prodigy, not the boy everyone remembered. He was quiet, unassuming, nearly invisible in the crowded halls of Elm Street Elementary and later Newnan High School. But inside, something was stirring. A hunger, not for fame, but for expression. A need to turn the ache of longing into something beautiful. At 12, he received a guitar, a cheap, battered instrument that his mother somehow scraped together the money to buy. It was not a gift of luxury, but of faith. Ruth saw something in her youngest son that the world had not yet noticed. A spark that needed only kindling. Alan taught himself to play, fumbling through chords in that cramped bedroom, calluses forming on fingers that would one day write songs heard by millions. Gospel first, then the country standards he heard on WSM radio drifting down from Nashville. Hank Williams, Merle Haggard, George Jones. Voices that sounded like truth felt like home. But music was not yet a dream. It was a hobby, a private refuge. In rural Georgia in the 1970s, boys like Alan did not become stars. They became mechanics like their fathers, worked honest jobs, married local girls, and lived quiet lives. And for years, that seemed like Alan's destiny too. After high school, there was no record deal waiting, no scout in the audience, no fairy tale beginning. Instead, there was a job at a shoe store, then construction work, then anything that paid enough to survive. He married his high school sweetheart, Denise, in 1979, a blonde-haired girl who had loved him since he was just another face in the hallway. Together, they built a life of beautiful ordinariness. A small apartment, bills that barely got paid, dreams whispered late at night, but never spoken aloud in daylight. Denise worked as a flight attendant. Alan worked wherever work could be found, and the guitar sat in the corner, faithful and patient. For nearly a decade, Alan Jackson was no one. Just another Southern boy with calloused hands and a quiet ache for something more. The world did not know his name. Nashville had never heard his voice. And yet, inside that invisibility, a songwriter was being forged. Not in spotlight or studio, but in silence, struggle, and the unshakable belief that songs could matter. The boy from Newnan, Georgia, was not ready yet, but he was getting closer. In 1985, Alan and Denise made a decision that seemed reckless to everyone who knew them. They loaded everything they owned into a battered car and drove north toward Nashville, Tennessee, chasing a dream so fragile it could shatter with a single rejection. Alan was 27 years old, an age when most aspiring musicians had already either made it or given up. He had no connections, no demo tape that mattered, no manager whispering promises in his ear. What he had was a notebook full of songs no one had heard, and a wife who believed in him more than he believed in himself. Nashville in the mid-1980s was a fortress. The city glittered with neon promise, but behind the lights lay an industry that chewed up dreamers and spat them out with ruthless efficiency. For every Garth Brooks or Randy Travis breaking through, there were 10,000 voices singing in empty bars, working day jobs, sleeping in cars, waiting for a chance that never came. Alan found work in the mailroom at the Nashville network, the same place where future stars and forgotten failures sorted fan letters and packages. It was humiliating in its familiarity, a cruel echo of so many who had walked this path before. By day, he delivered mail to people whose names were already on marquees. By night, he played dive bars for tips that barely covered gas. Denise kept them afloat financially, flying routes as a flight attendant while her husband chased what must have seemed like an impossible fantasy. She worked exhausting schedules, came home to a cramped apartment, and never once suggested they give up and go home. Years later, Alan would say with trembling gratitude, "Without Denise, there is no career. There is no music. There is nothing. She sacrificed everything." The rejections came in waves. Record labels passed without explanation. Publishers returned his songs with polite dismissals. Showcases ended with half-empty rooms and lukewarm applause. Month after month, year after year, the answer was always the same. Not quite. Not yet. Not you. There were nights Alan sat alone in their apartment, guitar in hand, wondering if he had dragged his wife away from Georgia for nothing, if the songs that felt so true to him were simply not good enough for a world that wanted something slicker, something safer, something more. But then came 1990, and with it, a break so unlikely it felt like divine intervention. Denise, working a flight, found herself serving Glenn Campbell, the legendary country star whose voice had defined an era. In a moment of courage that changed everything, she approached him during the flight, told him about her husband, and asked if he might listen to Alan's music. Most celebrities would have smiled politely and forgotten the conversation before landing. Glenn Campbell did not. He took Alan's demo tape, listened to it, and heard something the industry had missed. Authenticity. Truth. A voice that sounded like it came from the same soil as Hank Williams and Merle Haggard. Campbell made a call. That call led to another. And suddenly, after 5 years of brutal rejection, doors that had been bolted shut began to crack open. Arista Records, a label searching for traditional country in an era increasingly dominated by pop country crossover, offered Alan Jackson a contract. It was not a guarantee of stardom, not a promise of riches. It was simply a chance. One single chance to prove that a voice rooted in honesty could still matter. In 1989, Alan entered a recording studio not as a mailroom clerk or a struggling songwriter, but as an artist with something to prove. His debut album, Here in the Real World, dropped in 1990, and the title track climbed the charts with steady, undeniable momentum. It was not an explosion. It was a slow burn, but it was real. The album eventually went platinum, and suddenly the boy from Newnan, Georgia, the man who had sorted mail and played to empty rooms, had a voice the world was beginning to hear. The struggle had not broken him. It had sharpened him. Every rejection, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had carved away everything false, leaving only the truest parts. And those parts, it turned out, were exactly what country music needed. Alan Jackson was no longer invisible. He was emerging, and the best was yet to come. The 1990s belonged to Alan Jackson in a way few artists ever experience. What began as a single chance exploded into a decade-defining run that reshaped country music itself. Here in the Real World was just the beginning. By 1991, his sophomore album, Don't Rock the Jukebox, cemented him not as a fleeting trend, but as a force. The title track became an anthem, a defiant declaration that traditional country still mattered in an industry increasingly seduced by pop production and rock influences. "Don't rock the jukebox, I want to hear some Jones," he sang, invoking George Jones as the standard, the North Star, the measure of authenticity. It was not just a lyric, it was a mission statement. While others chased crossover success and MTV airplay, Alan planted his flag firmly in the soil of honky-tonk tradition. The hits came relentlessly. Chattahoochee in 1993 became a cultural phenomenon, a joyful celebration of southern summers, skinny dipping, and the reckless innocence of youth. It was playful, infectious, and undeniably country, earning him his first CMA Entertainer of the Year award and proving that traditional sound could dominate radio. Then came Midnight in Montgomery in 1992, a haunting tribute to Hank Williams that felt less like a song and more like a spiritual encounter. Alan sang of pulling off to the side of the road in Montgomery, Alabama, and feeling Hank's ghost whispering through the night. It was reverent, eerie, and deeply moving, a reminder that country music was built on ghosts and sacred ground. Album after album followed. A lot about livin' and a little about love. In 1992, Who I Am in 1994, Everything I Love in 1996. Each one filled with songs that became Friday night anthems and Sunday morning reflections. She's Got the Rhythm and I Got the Blues. Summertime Blues. Little Bitty. There Goes. By the late 1990s, Alan Jackson had amassed 15 #1 singles, sold over 30 million albums, and become one of the biggest names in country music. He filled arenas, headlined festivals, and stood on stages where legends once stood, carrying their torch with humility and fierce conviction. But his rise was not without conflict. The 1990s were a battleground for country music's soul. On one side stood traditionalists like Allen, George Strait, and Randy Travis holding the line. On the other, a new wave of pop country acts blurred the genre into something shinier, safer, more palatable to mainstream audiences. Allen watched as country radio shifted, as steel guitars disappeared, as songs began to sound more like rock ballads with a twang. He saw artists abandoning fiddles for synthesizers, trading authenticity for crossover appeal. And while he never attacked his peers publicly, his music became his response. In 1999, he released Papa Top, a cover of a classic honky-tonk heartbreaker on an album titled Under the Influence, a deliberate homage to the giants who shaped him: Hank Williams Jr., Merle Haggard, George Jones, Charlie Pride. It was Allen's way of saying, "This is where I come from, and this is what I will never abandon." The industry respected him. Fellow artists revered him. George Jones himself, the man Allen had name-checked in Don't Rock the Jukebox, became a close friend and collaborator. To earn the blessing of the possum was to be anointed, and Allen wore that blessing with quiet pride. He was not flashy. He did not court controversy. He did not chase headlines or manufacture drama. He simply showed up, wore his cowboy hat, sang his songs, and let the music speak. And the music spoke with a clarity that could not be ignored. By the end of the 1990s, Alan Jackson was no longer the struggling songwriter from Newnan, Georgia. He was a superstar, a keeper of tradition, a voice trusted by millions. His concerts were pilgrimages for fans who felt alienated by the genre's shift toward pop. When Alan sang, they heard their own lives reflected back, their struggles, their joys, their small-town stories told with dignity and truth. And yet, even as he stood at the peak of success, as awards filled his shelves and his name became synonymous with authentic country music, the hardest trials of his life were still ahead. Fame had lifted him, but it would not protect him from the losses that were coming. The boy who once played guitar in a cramped Georgia bedroom had become a king. But kings, as Alan would learn with devastating clarity, are not immune to heartbreak. And the storms gathering on his horizon would test not just his music, but his faith, his family, and his very will to continue. September 11th, 2001, shattered America in ways no one could have imagined. Towers collapsed, thousands died, and a nation sat paralyzed in front of television screens, watching the unthinkable unfold in real time. For most Americans, the question was not whether to speak, but whether words even existed for such horror. For Alan Jackson, the silence was unbearable. He sat in his home, watching the footage loop endlessly, feeling the same crushing helplessness as millions of others. But inside him, something was stirring. Not anger, not politics, but grief. Pure, unfiltered grief. He did not sit down to write a hit. He did not craft a song for radio or awards. He simply picked up his guitar and let the questions pour out. Where were you when the world stopped turning on that September day? The song that emerged was not polished or produced. It was raw, hesitant, almost conversational. Alan sang of teaching his children, of rocking babies, of faith and fear, and the simple acts of love that become lifelines when the world collapses. He did not try to explain the tragedy or offer easy answers. He simply asked the question everyone was asking themselves. Where were you? For weeks, he kept the song private, unsure if it was too personal, too simple, too vulnerable. But when he finally played it for his team, the response was immediate. Tears, silence, and the overwhelming sense that this was not just a song. It was a mirror for a grieving nation. On November 7, 2001, less than 2 months after the attacks, Alan Jackson stood on the stage of the CMA Awards and performed "Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning" for the first time publicly. The audience, filled with country music's biggest stars, sat in stunned silence. Cameras captured tears streaming down the faces of hardened industry veterans. When the final note faded, there was a pause, a breath, and then the room erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. Recognition, gratitude, the relief of hearing someone give voice to what they all felt but could not say. The song was released immediately, not as a calculated single, but as an urgent necessity. Radio stations played it constantly. It climbed to #1, not through marketing, but through sheer emotional weight. Americans called in requesting it, dedicating it, using it to process the unprocessable. At the 2002 Grammy Awards, "Where Were You" won Song of the Year, one of the few country songs ever to claim that honor. But the award was secondary. What mattered was that Alan Jackson, the boy from Newnan who sang about Chattahoochee rivers and Friday night fish fries, had become the voice of a nation in its darkest hour. He did not seek that role. He did not campaign for it. It found him because his instinct had always been to speak truth simply, without pretense, without agenda. And in a moment when America needed simplicity and truth more than ever, his voice was the one that broke through. Years later, he would recall that moment with characteristic humility. "I didn't write that song to be important. I wrote it because I didn't know what else to do with what I was feeling." That honesty, that refusal to grandstand or exploit tragedy, was precisely why it mattered. "Where Were You" became more than a hit. It became a hymn, a ritual, a way for people to gather their grief and hold it together for 3 minutes and 39 seconds. It played at memorials, at vigils, at moments of silence across the country. And in that, Alan Jackson proved something essential. That country music, at its best, is not escapism. It is witness. It is the voice that speaks when others cannot. It is the song that sits beside you in the dark and says, "I feel it too." He had given the nation a gift, but the cost of carrying that gift, of being the vessel for such collective pain, would mark him in ways no one could see. Behind every sold-out arena, every #1 hit, every award and accolade, there was a truth Alan Jackson never let the world forget. None of it mattered more than the people waiting for him at home. Denise Jackson was not just his wife. She was the architect of his entire life. The high school sweetheart who saw something in a quiet Georgia boy when no one else did. The woman who worked grueling flight attendant schedules to keep them afloat while he chased an impossible dream. The one who approached Glenn Campbell on an airplane and changed the trajectory of everything. They married in 1979. 2 kids with nothing but love and hope. Through the lean years in Nashville, through the rejections and the doubt, through the explosion of fame that could have shattered them, Denise remained his anchor. While other marriages in the industry crumbled under the weight of touring and temptation, theirs endured. But it was not always easy. Fame brings pressure that most marriages cannot survive. Long stretches on the road, constant attention, the slow erosion of privacy. There were moments, Alan would later admit, when the foundation cracked, when the distance became too much, when they both wondered if they could survive the life his success demanded. In 2002, Denise published a memoir titled "It's All About Him, Finding the Love of My Life. In it, she revealed with startling honesty that their marriage had nearly collapsed. Infidelity, separation, the very real possibility of divorce. It was not a tabloid exposé, but a testimony of two people who fought to save what they had built. Alan did not hide from it. He acknowledged his failures publicly, with the same plain-spoken honesty that defined his music. I messed up. I hurt the person I loved most. And I had to fight to earn back what I almost destroyed. They rebuilt, through counseling, through faith, through the stubborn refusal to let fame steal what mattered most. And when they emerged on the other side, their marriage was not just intact. It was stronger, forged in the fire of almost losing each other. Together, they raised 3 daughters, Maddie, Alexandra, and Danny. Alan shielded them fiercely from the spotlight, refusing to let them become accessories to his fame. They grew up in Tennessee, not in Hollywood. They attended regular schools, lived relatively normal lives, and learned early that their father's job was just that, a job, not an identity. Maddie, the eldest, became a songwriter herself, carrying forward the family's creative legacy. Allie and Danny pursued their own paths, grounded in the values Alan and Denise had fought so hard to preserve. For Alan, fatherhood was sacred. He scheduled tours around recitals and graduations. He turned down opportunities that would keep him away too long. He made it clear to everyone in the industry that his family came first, always. In interviews, he spoke of his daughters with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to his stoic public image. Everything I've done, every song, every stage, it all means nothing if I fail them, he once said, his voice thick with emotion. Denise and the girls were not just his foundation. They were his reason. The why behind every decision, every sacrifice, every choice to stay true to who he was, rather than chase what the industry wanted him to become. And as the years rolled on, as fame became routine and hits became legacy, Alan never forgot the truth that had saved him. That the boy from Newnan, Georgia, had been blessed not with talent alone, but with a woman who believed in him when belief was all they had. And with 3 daughters who reminded him daily that the greatest legacy is not measured in platinum records, but in the love you leave behind. But even the strongest foundations can be shaken, and the storms coming for the Jackson family would test every ounce of that strength. September 12, 2018. A date that would cleave the Jackson family's life into before and after. Maddie Jackson Seligman, Alan's eldest daughter, had built a beautiful life. She had married Ben Seligman, her college sweetheart, in 2014. They were young, vibrant, and deeply in love. Ben was an assistant district attorney in Davidson County, Tennessee, a man dedicated to justice, respected by colleagues, adored by family. Together, Maddie and Ben had started a family of their own. A son, their firstborn, filled their home with laughter and chaos, and the messy, perfect joy of new parenthood. The future stretched ahead like an open road, filled with promise. And then, in a single, horrific instant, it all shattered. Ben Seligman died suddenly while on a boat outing in the Florida Keys. The details were sparse, the circumstances devastating. He was helping on a boat when he fell and struck his head on the vessel's propeller. The injury was catastrophic, immediate, fatal. He was 28 years old. Maddie, just 29, became a widow. Her son lost his father before he was old enough to remember him. And Alan Jackson, the man who had sung about heartbreak for decades, faced a grief so brutal that no song could touch it. This was not the heartbreak of a broken romance or a lost opportunity. This was the unspeakable agony of watching your child bury her husband, of seeing your daughter, once radiant with hope, hollowed out by a loss no parent should witness, of holding your grandson and knowing he would grow up with only photographs and stories of the man who should have been there. Alan, who had always been private about family pain, retreated into silence. There were no public statements, no interviews dissecting the tragedy. The family released a brief, dignified announcement asking for privacy, and then the curtain fell. But those close to the Jacksons saw the devastation. Friends recalled Alan as shattered, unable to find words for what had been stolen. Denise, ever the family's pillar, held Maddie through waves of grief that seemed endless. And Maddie herself faced the impossible task of rebuilding a life that had been torn apart without warning. The funeral was private, attended only by family and close friends. Alan stood beside his daughter as Ben was laid to rest, and those who were there would later describe a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. No eulogy could capture the cruelty of it. No prayer could answer the question that hung in the air like smoke. Why? In the months that followed, Maddie showed a strength that seemed impossible. She focused on her son, on giving him stability and love, even as her own world remained in pieces. She leaned on faith, on family, on the belief that somehow, impossibly, she would survive this. Alan and Denise surrounded her with support, stepping in to help with their grandson, creating routines and rituals that offered fragile comfort. But nothing could fill the void. Nothing could erase the reality that Ben was gone, that Maddie was alone, that a little boy would never know his father's voice. For Alan, the loss cut in ways he could barely articulate. He had spent his career writing songs about life's struggles, about loss and faith and perseverance. But this was different. This was not material for a song. This was a wound that would never fully heal, a scar etched onto his family that no melody could soothe. He once told a close friend, his voice breaking, "You spend your whole life trying to protect your children from pain. And then something like this happens, and you realize you're powerless, completely powerless." The Jackson family would never be the same. The laughter at holiday gatherings would always carry an echo of absence. Every milestone in his grandson's life would be bittersweet, marked by the man who should have been there to witness it. Maddie's tragedy became the Jackson family's silent shadow, a grief carried privately, with dignity, but never forgotten. And for Alan, it was a reminder that even faith, even fame, even the deepest love cannot protect you from life's most merciless blows. If Maddie's tragedy had already broken something fundamental in Alan Jackson, what came next felt like the universe had decided he had not suffered enough. In 2021, at 62 years old, Alan stood before cameras and revealed a secret he had been carrying for over a decade. A diagnosis so cruel in its precision that it seemed designed specifically to torture a man whose entire identity was built on performing. Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, CMT, a degenerative neurological disorder with no cure, no treatment, and no mercy. For most people, the name means nothing. But for those who carry it, CMT is a slow, relentless thief. It attacks the peripheral nerves, the fragile network that connects the brain and spinal cord to muscles throughout the body. Over time, it steals balance, coordination, strength. It turns simple acts like walking, standing, or gripping a guitar into monumental challenges. For a performer whose life depended on commanding stages, on standing under lights for hours, on moving with confidence and presence, CMT was not just a disease. It was a death sentence delivered in agonizing slow motion. Alan inherited the condition from his father, Daddy Gene, who had lived with it quietly, never naming it, never complaining. Gene had simply pushed through, working as a mechanic even as his hands weakened, his balance faltered, his body betrayed him. He taught Alan to endure by example, showing him that you do not surrender to pain, you simply outlast it. But inheriting the gene meant Alan had been living with CMT for years, without realizing it. The subtle stumbles, the increasing difficulty with balance, the strange numbness in his feet. He had dismissed it all as aging, as the toll of decades on the road, as something that could be managed with rest. By the time he received the formal diagnosis around 2011, the disease had already begun its work, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. He kept it secret for 10 years. Through tours, through albums, through performances where fans saw only the steady, reliable presence of a country music legend, Alan was quietly fighting a war against his own body. He adjusted his stage movements, held onto microphone stands a little longer, shortened his sets when the tremors became too much. But CMT is progressive. What starts as mild weakness becomes debilitating. What begins as occasional loss of balance becomes constant instability. And for a man whose career required him to stand before thousands, to walk confidently across stages, to perform with the physical stamina of someone half his age, the disease was suffocating. When he finally went public in September 2021, it was not out of desire for sympathy, but out of necessity. Fans had begun to notice. The stumbles were more frequent. His performances seemed shorter, more cautious. Rumors swirled, and Alan, ever honest, decided the truth was better than speculation. "I have this neuropathy, a neurological disease," he told the world plainly. "It's genetic. I inherited it from my daddy. There's no cure for it, but it's been affecting me for years. It's getting more and more obvious. I know I'm stumbling around on stage, and now I'm having a little trouble balancing even in front of the microphone. I'm just very uncomfortable." The words landed like a gut punch. Fans who had grown up with his music, who had danced to Chattahoochee and wept to Remember When, suddenly faced the reality that the voice and presence they loved was being slowly, cruelly dismantled. But Alan's tone was not one of defeat. It was resignation mixed with defiance. "I'm not going to live forever," he said with characteristic bluntness. "Nobody does. My dad died at 86. I'm probably going to live a little while longer than that if the good Lord allows it. But it's not going to kill me. It's just going to make my life more miserable as time goes on." The cruelty of CMT is not just physical. It is psychological. Every performance becomes a reminder of what is being lost. Every stumble on stage is a public humiliation, a visible marker of decline. For a man who built his career on reliability, on being the steady voice in an unstable industry, the disease felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. And yet, he refused to stop. Despite the pain, despite the increasing difficulty, despite knowing that every tour could be his last, Alan kept performing. Not out of greed or ego, but out of love. Love for the music. Love for the fans who had walked with him for 4 decades. Love for the tradition he had sworn to uphold. But the question haunted him, and everyone who loved him. How much longer could he continue? How many more stages before the disease forced him to stop? How many more songs before his voice, still strong, was trapped in a body that could no longer carry it? CMT had given Alan Jackson a ticking clock, and no one, not even him, knew how much time was left. After the diagnosis went public, The world watched Alan Jackson with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. He could have retired, he could have cited his health, stepped away from the spotlight with dignity, and spent his remaining years in peace with family. But that was never Alan's way. Instead, he chose to keep singing, to keep touring, to keep showing up on stages across America, even as his body made every performance a battle. It was not stubbornness, it was devotion to the music, to the fans, to the promise he had made to himself decades earlier that he would never abandon country music's roots. The physical toll became impossible to hide. Fans who attended his concerts in 2022 and 2023 saw a man transformed. Gone was the effortless stride across the stage. Alan now moved carefully, deliberately, gripping the microphone stand like a lifeline. His balance wavered. His steps were cautious, measured, each one a conscious effort to avoid falling. Between songs, he sat on a stool, catching his breath, gathering strength for the next number. The tremors in his hands were visible when he adjusted his guitar. His feet, ravaged by nerve damage, could no longer feel the floor beneath them, turning every step into an act of faith. Concert footage from this era is difficult to watch. Not because his voice had failed, it remained strong, rich, unmistakably Alan Jackson, but because the contrast was so stark. The man who once commanded stages with quiet confidence now struggled simply to stand. And yet, he sang. Every word clear, every note true. As if the disease could steal his balance but never his soul. Fans responded with overwhelming love. They cheered longer, louder, not just for the songs, but for the man singing them. They understood what it cost him to be there. They saw the pain etched in his movements, the exhaustion in his face after every show. And they loved him more for refusing to give up. Social media filled with testimonials. People who had seen him perform wrote of weeping openly, not from sadness, but from awe. "He can barely stand," one fan wrote, "but he's still giving us everything he has. That's not just a performer, that's a hero." Alan deflected such praise with characteristic humility. "I'm not a hero," he said in one interview. "I'm just a guy who loves to sing. And as long as I can still do that, I will." But behind the scenes, the struggle was relentless. Tours were shortened, performances carefully spaced to allow for recovery. His team worked to accommodate his limitations, arranging stages with railings, positioning stools strategically, ensuring he was never more than a few steps from support. Denise traveled with him constantly, a silent guardian watching from the wings, ready to steady him if he stumbled. His daughters visited when they could, bringing his grandchildren, giving him reasons to keep fighting beyond the music. The irony was brutal. Alan Jackson had spent 40 years proving that traditional country music still mattered, that authenticity could triumph over trends. He had outlasted the pop country crossover wave, the bro country era, every shift and fad that threatened to erase what he stood for. And now, just as the industry was beginning to rediscover its roots, just as younger artists cited him as an influence, just as his legacy was being fully appreciated, his own body was betraying him. But he refused bitterness. In interviews, he spoke not of what he was losing, but of gratitude for what he had been given. 40 years of stages, millions of fans, a catalog of songs that would outlive him, a family that loved him, a life that, despite its tragedies, had been rich with meaning. "I've been blessed," he said simply, "more than I ever deserved." And so he continued, one performance at a time, one song at a time, stumbling, struggling, but still standing. Still singing, still Alan Jackson. Because some men, when faced with the end, choose to fade quietly, and others choose to burn until the very last note. Today, Alan Jackson stands at the intersection of legend and mortality. At 66 years old, he is simultaneously one of country music's most revered figures and a man facing the gradual erosion of the very abilities that made him famous. His legacy is already carved in stone. Over 80 million records sold worldwide, 35 #1 hits on the Billboard country charts, 2 Grammy Awards, 16 CMA Awards, induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2017, an honor that brought him to tears as he accepted, overwhelmed not by pride, but by gratitude. The statistics are staggering, but they tell only part of the story. Alan's true legacy lives in the songs themselves. Chattahoochee. Remember when? Where were you when the world stopped turning? Drive. It's 5 o'clock somewhere. Little Bitty. Gone. Songs that became the soundtrack of American life, played at weddings and funerals, on back roads and in honky-tonks, whispered by fathers to daughters, and sung by strangers who became friends through shared lyrics. He did not just make hit records. He preserved a tradition. When Nashville chased pop crossover success in the 1990s and 2000s, when steel guitars disappeared from radio and lyrics became indistinguishable from rock ballads, Alan held the line. He proved that authenticity could still sell, that traditional country still mattered, that there was hunger for music rooted in truth, rather than trends. Younger artists now cite him as the reason they pursued country music. Luke Combs, John Pardy, Cody Johnson, artists carrying forward the traditional sound, all point to Alan Jackson as the template. The proof that you can stay true to yourself and still succeed. But beyond the accolades and influence, Alan's deepest legacy may be what he taught about endurance. Not just the endurance of a career, but the endurance of the human spirit when faced with unspeakable loss. He buried his father before he achieved fame. He lost his mother during his peak. He watched his daughter bury her husband. He received a diagnosis that slowly steals his ability to perform. And through it all, he kept showing up, kept singing, kept believing. His faith, rooted in the simple gospel hymns of his Georgia childhood, became his anchor. He speaks of God not with theatricality or preachiness, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has walked through fire and found something still standing on the other side. "I don't understand why things happen the way they do," he once said, "but I believe there's a reason. And I believe that even in the hardest times, there's grace if you're willing to see it." That grace is visible in how he lives now. At his Tennessee farm, he moves slowly but deliberately, spending mornings with Denise, afternoons with grandchildren who climb onto his lap and beg for stories. He still writes songs occasionally, though he no longer chases hits. He writes because the need to create has never left him. His schedule has slowed dramatically. Tours are rare, performances selective. When he does take the stage, it is understood that it could be one of the last times. Fans arrive not just to hear the songs, but to witness something sacred. A man refusing to surrender, even as his body demands it. And when the lights dim and the crowd falls silent, when Alan Jackson's voice fills the room singing, "Remember when," there is not a dry eye in the house. Because everyone understands the weight of those lyrics now. Remember when we said, "When we turned gray," when the children grow up and move away, we won't be sad. We'll be glad for all the life we've had. He wrote those words decades ago, but now he lives them. Alan Jackson's story is not one of unbroken triumph. It is a story of perseverance through pain, of faith tested by tragedy, of a man who gave everything to preserve something bigger than himself, and who now faces the cost of that devotion with dignity. He will not live forever. No one does. But the songs will. The voice will echo long after the man is gone. And somewhere, on a back road in Georgia, or a honky-tonk in Texas, or a living room anywhere in America, someone will press play on Chattahoochee, or Where Were You? And remember. Remember a voice that sounded like home. Remember a man who never pretended to be more than he was. Remember a boy from Newnan, Georgia, who became a legend by simply telling the truth. That is legacy. That is immortality. That is Alan Jackson. And so we reach the end of this journey, not the end of Alan Jackson's story, that is still being written with every sunrise, every song, every moment with those he loves. But the end of what we can tell you today. This is not a story of a flawless hero. Alan has stumbled, made mistakes, hurt those he loved, and carried regrets. But perhaps that is precisely why his story matters. Because he shows us that greatness is not about perfection, it is about perseverance. He teaches us that you can rise from poverty without forgetting where you came from, that you can achieve fame without selling your soul, that you can face devastating loss and still choose to stand, that you can watch your body fail and still refuse to surrender the things that define you. Behind the cowboy hat and the humble Georgia drawl lies a man who has given us more than music. He has given us proof that authenticity still matters in a world that often rewards pretense. That tradition is worth defending even when the industry moves on. That love, family, and faith are the only things that endure when everything else fades. Alan Jackson's voice may one day fall silent, but the songs will remain. And in them, we will always find the truth of who we are. Small-town dreamers, broken-hearted fighters, people searching for meaning in a world that moves too fast. If his music ever moved you, if his voice ever felt like home, honor that now. Leave a like. Share this story. Let others know that behind every legend is a human being who bled for what they built. And remember, the greatest legacy is not measured in awards or sales, but in the lives touched, the hearts healed, and the moments when a stranger's song made you feel less alone. Thank you for walking this road with us, and thank you, Alan Jackson, for never giving up on the music that matters.